Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 3, Halacha 5, and we're continuing on the issues in the Mishnah about going to be covering yourself with water. Now, we were talking about the laws of Baal, Keri, and I just wanted to point out it's interesting that in the organization of the Shas, that the laws of the Onin, which is the mourning and all of the stuff having to do with death, is going to be placed right before the laws of Baal Keri, and that these are things that are things of death or things of decay or things of mourning, and that the laws of Baal Keri and things of particularly wasting seed, which the Zohar says is the worst sin in the Torah, that these are things that take you away from the source of life. In other words, what this is saying is that anything that takes you away from doing mitzvahs, from prayer, or from learning Torah is something that's a diminishment of life. And it takes you away from that. You can see the seriousness of it. And as we were talking about yesterday, particularly when it becomes very strict, when this stuff all happens for self-gratification. In the case yesterday, it was talking about self-gratification or gratification when the person was sick, and then he's going to be treated strictly. And in fact, the person, the Rabbi Ami, said that it's like he should die. So the laws of Baal Keri and death. He doesn't literally have corpse tuma, but he does have tuma. And everything that takes you away from observance, prayer, and learning is something that takes you away from the source of life, and it diminishes you. And the point of being alive is to purify yourself so that you can perfect the creation and that you can have effect in refining this world and bringing out what the world was supposed to be created as. And one of the other serious things about the case yesterday with Rabbi Ami pointing out the sick person becoming a Baal Keri from self-gratification or from gratification was that this is a diminishment where you're actually taking things away from how the world is supposed to be running from the original creation. The world is supposed to be running in this world with kedusha and holiness, and not a world with tuma. And we know that in the Midrash, in Midrash Rabbah, I believe it's Perek 10 in Midrash Berechot Rabbah. I believe it's 10 Safe 3. But it's talking about how the primordial world was created, and that the world is created like a kli. And all the laws of kalim, you have to worry about the kalim being tahor, and so that you're really doing something that is antithetical to how the creation is. So be very careful. The Gemara is going to turn back to the Mishnah. I'm going to say that the next section of the Mishnah states, but if he is unable to do all this, in other words, leave the mikvah and cover himself before sunrise, he should cover himself with water and recite the Shema. Now, the Gemara is going to get into why the Mishnah is going to allow him to recite the Shema when his heart can effectively still see nakedness. What's going on here? So the Gemara continues, says, the Mishnah refers to the mikvah of cloudy water, which conceals his nakedness. Now, this is why you need to have the oral law and the Amorim pointing out the tradition that they receive from the Tanaim and that they receive from the Zugot and so on and so forth, because how would you know from the Mishnah that this is referring to cloudy water? Now, if you were thinking about it carefully, you would say, wait a second, if you have clear water, the person's limbs are all discernible. You could see it. And if you have cloudy water, you couldn't. So it would be like a cover. Now, the laws of And there's a theme all throughout the Tanakh and the Torah. We're talking about concealment, right? And God is a God, and it says in literally written in the Torah, it could be written where it's written God of concealment, right? There's one verse that doesn't have a vav in where it says olam, and instead of saying eternity, it's written as concealment, right? Concealment is always going to be an issue. That's why modesty is so important for a man and a woman. But notice that in the laws for Yoma on when they bring in the incense, there also has to be the cloud cover over the ark before they can do anything. And says over there that the cloud has to be there before my presence can come. So that there's always going to be a thing of opaqueness and a necessity for opaqueness and coverings and things like that. That, in other words, like the Torah scroll itself, it has a cover. So we could see here a theme and say that, yeah, when you think about it clearly, it must be that this is talking about in Mikvah where it has cloudy water, because clear water would seem to be antithetical to the other ideas in the Torah itself, and that is in fact what the Shulchan Aruch is saying over there in 74:2. It's talking about that if the water has it where the person's limbs can't be seen. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, however, when standing in clear water, he is prohibited to recite the Shema, but if he is able to cloud the water with his feet, he may cloud the water and then say the Shema. Now, keep in mind when you're going to get ready for Yoma and for Yom Kippur and studying the laws of bringing the incense, lighting incense outside of the Holy of Holies and then bringing it in, that you're creating this cloud, and that this is an idea before that even for the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, there's a demand that before the presence, the divine presence comes down and rests there has to be a cloud. And so too, before you're sitting there and connecting with this Ein Od Movado idea and the Shema, there's also supposed to be a covering on you, that you're supposed to have some sort of distance where you're not sitting there totally in the naked. So there's a lot of connected themes here. And the Gemara is going to quote a Baraisa related to the Mishnah's final ruling that one may not recite the Shema or even other sacred words within 4 amos of excrement. And by the way, somebody who does not go to the Bet Din after being called 3 times, it is the same law. You're not, that person also counts like human excrement, and you're not allowed to go and say holy words within 4 amos of him. And you should stay away from people like that. The Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, a Baraisa teaches one must distance himself 4 amos from human excrement and 4 amos from canine excrement, but only when it is being applied to hides. Now, I want to point out something from Rashi and Hagiga 4a, okay, that hides are going to be placed inside the excrement of dogs as part of the tanning process. And basically, it's going to be breaking down the leather. And Rashi continues on that and says that the mixture produces a terrible odor, which I'm sure you can imagine, at which point the canine excrement prohibits the recitation of the Shema, and human excrement is never used in the tanning process, and so the Baraisa must mean that it affects the surroundings even without the presence of hides. Now, I want to point out the Beur Halacha 79:1, where it's saying that human excrement is intrinsically repulsive, even if it lacks an odor. And sacred words may not be recited within 4 amos of it. And if it does have an odor, one must distance himself for amos from where the odor dissipates. In other words, that you have to be where the smell is and where the smell stops. You have to go to where the smell stops and go 4 amos from where the odor dissipates. That's the law. So I want to point out that the Orach Chaim in 79.4 is pointing out that when canine feces is applied to hides, they become the equivalent of human excrement with all the stringencies. However, it is not clear whether, like human excrement, they retain their prohibitive power even after they've stopped emitting an odor. And one of the hardest jobs that you can do, says the duties of the heart in Gate 4, is to be a tanner. Being a tanner or a miner is very difficult physically. Anyway, the Gemara is going to discuss what other items are treated like human excrement in the sense that they render their surroundings unfit for holy utterances. Rabbi Yerushalmi, in the name of Rabbi Zera, says, a carcass that became putrid, one must distance himself 4 amos from it. And uttering sacred words is forbidden not only near human excrement, but near other things that have a foul odor. Rabbi Avina in the Gemara says, and our Mishnah taught likewise, how far must one distance himself from them and from excrement before reciting the Shema? 4 amos. In other words, them is going to be talking about the steeping water that we were just talking about in the Mishnah. Steeping water is going to be foul. That is something like what they used to do when they would soak flax seeds in it. When they'd soak flax seeds in it, it would become very, very smelly. So obviously, it seems that you have to distance yourself from bad smelling items, even other than human excrement. Now, that's the point of Rabbi Avina. The Gemara is going to deflect that. Okay. Rabbi Ami says in the name of Rabbi Shammai, this is not necessarily the Shammai who is the Zugot. This is an Amara. Interpret the Mishnah as referring to the steeping waters of launderers who wash clothing that have been soiled with human excrement. But if something has a foul odor that does not emanate from human excrement, like a bad smelling carcass, right? Its presence does not prohibit holy utterances. Now, the Gemara is going to reject this. Rabbi Mani said to him, if the Mishnah deals with the steeping waters of launderers, the following problem arises. It says, but we learned in the Mishnah, he may cover himself neither with foul water nor with steeping water. In other words, what this is saying is that the bad smelling water would include water used to clean items soiled with human excrement. And therefore, steeping water cannot mean the same thing. Rather, it must mean water in which flax was soaked. In other words, it's not saying that some of the laundry water might have some excrement in it. It's actually talking about the use of water for something else, and namely over here, soaking flax. Now, the Mishnah is going to support Rabbi Yerushalmi's ruling that even items other than human excrement can render their surroundings unfit for holy utterances. There's going to be a lot of cases what that could be, and the Gemara is going to find how old a child must be for his waist to render the surroundings unclean. In other words, the Gemara is always going to want to know what is going to be the limit, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, is there a minimum, is there a maximum? That's always going to be a big question. So, like over here, what's going to be the minimum size and how young? Always does that. So, Gemara says, a Baraisa teaches, once a miner is able to eat an olive's volume of grain, we must separate ourselves 4 amos from his excrement or urine in order to say sacred words. So there's a lot of things going on here. This could be grain referring to one of the 5 species. That could be wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt. So what's going on here? The Orach Chaim in 612 say 4 says that he must be able to eat a kazait, that's an olive's volume of grain, within the time it takes the average adult to eat a standard, half a standard loaf of bread. And a standard loaf has the volume of 8 eggs according to the Tana, or 6 according to another. And so a para is the volume of 4 eggs or 3 eggs according to the other Tana. And basically, this is going to be a halacha l'moshe l'sinai, where it says that the time it takes to eat a paris has a minimum set time in this halacha l'moshe l'sinai for a single act of eating. In other words, it's estimating that its length range between 3 and 9 minutes. There's a lot of other things going on. We know that the time that a child starts eating wheat is when they start to speak, and that's one of the indications, says one of the sages, of when that wheat was actually going to be the tree of knowledge in the garden, and so that this is looping back to that idea over there, so that it's physically developing him mentally, but also physically, and it's changing him. That's the underlying premise, underlying theme here. So that the Brisa teaches that once a minor is able to eat an olive's volume of grain, and again, this links back to what another sage says about eating the wheat. When they start to eat wheat, they start to speak, and effectively changes them. And the Gemara continues, says, we must separate ourselves 4 amos from his excrement or urine in order to say sacred words. But if he cannot eat an olive's volume of grain, we need not separate ourselves neither from his excrement nor from his urine 4 amos. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a related discussion, and they ask in the presence of Rabbi Abahu, why must we separate ourselves from human excrement and urine, but not from the waste of most other creatures? What is it about man that causes his waste to smell worse than theirs? And the Gemara continues and says, he said to them, it is because his thoughts are bad. In other words, says that's a very deep idea. Avos de Rabbi Nassan in 1903 says the following. It says that man's wastes are imbued with a foul odor in order to check his arrogance. An analogy may be drawn to a royal palace through which the awful stench of a tannery wafted. And every passer-by would remark how beautiful the palace was, but the smell, except for the smell of the tannery, and man is similarly tainted with a foul odor of his waste, and still he lords himself over other creatures. How much more arrogant would he be if his waste had a pleasant odor? So, Haredim points out about this, that, what evil urges are possessed by an infant just old enough to eat a kazait of grain? What's going on here? But again, this is linking back to the creation, because in the creation where you have, potentially the tree of knowledge being the wheat, the child is spiritually changing once he eats that wheat. And that's really going to be the answer. It's not a literal answer. What, bad thoughts could, or bad urges would the child have? Really what it is it's a spiritual change in the person. And it's hearkening back to the ultimate start of enlightenment in a way, but also degradation that came about from them eating the tree of knowledge, which could have been the wheat. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, so in other words, but if he is, and they responded to him, right? So he says to them, it's because the thoughts are bad. And they responded to him. They said, but is he not an infant when his excrement becomes bad smelling? In other words, does an infant have bad thoughts, right? And so he replies, and he says to them, and is it not written, for the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth? That's in Genesis 8:21. And Rabbi Yudin said in explanation of this verse, it says, the words for from his youth is written in such a way that it can be rendered from his stirrings. Now, I need a little bit of help here on the Meforshim, and here's what Mizrahi says about this. And it says that most forms of the word ne'orim, youth, that appear in Scripture are between a vav, with a vav between the ayin and the resh. But here the vav is omitted, allowing us to relate the word na'ar, which would be to shake or to stir, which is spelt without a vav. And in Job 38:13, it says the wicked were shaken from it, and the word may be rendered from his stirring. So that's a key point that the vav is missing there when it's written in the Torah in 8:21. So let's continue this. The word for his youth is written in such a way it can be rendered from his stirrings, which conveys that from the time one stirs to leave his mother's womb and go out into the world, he has an inclination from evil. The Haredim says about this that the sages knew, however, that the evil inclination does not exercise much control over a child until he is old enough to eat a kazait of grain. Before then, the odor that his waist emits is no greater than that of most animals and does not prescribe holy utterances in its presence. So in other words, what could be happening here is that once he tastes grain, again, Rabbi Yehuda is going to be identifying that as the tree of knowledge from which Adam and Eve ate. It was basically a stalk of wheat. And in other words, before this child eats grain, he may have evil inclinations or evil urges, but he lacks the intelligence to start to understand them. And once he starts to do that, you'll start to see a link between intelligence and the offensiveness of the waste, and that's basically the idea. And that the Haredim points out about this that Rabbi Yudan was quoted because he disagrees with the Brisa stated above, whereas the Brisa ruled that the presence of infant's waste forbids prayer only when he can eat a kazait of grain. So that's a deep idea spiritually, connecting back to the creation, and everything in the Torah is connected and is deep, so infinitely deep. The Mishnah taught that holy utterances are going to be forbidden in the presence of human waste. Now the Gemara is going to want to talk about what about animal waste. Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina said we must distance ourselves 4 amos from animal dung, and the ruling is going to be qualified. And Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzhak said it applies only to dung that is still soft. In other words, the Gemara is going to continue, and only to that of a donkey. So that's one opinion, that has to be soft and from a donkey. Another qualified the ruling and said, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, it applies only to the dung of a donkey that excretes when it has just come off the road. So Pnei Moshe says the exertion of a journey causes the donkey's excrement to have a more repulsive odor. That's something that we would not know about today because we don't really have donkeys or live lives where we come in contact with donkeys or use them for journeys, so we wouldn't know that. But that's why we need the Meforshim today to understand, because this was familiar to people for the majority of human history. We've only had a car for 120 years, and we've only had modern transport for about 70 years. And for the last 6,000 years, normally humans were using donkeys, and so they would know this, but we don't know this today. It is mass amnesia. We all forgot this. So the Gemara still knows this and records it and remembers it, and that's why Pnei Moshe points out that the exertion of a journey causes the donkey's excrement to change and have a more repulsive nature, which everybody who had a donkey back then would be able to point to and say, oh yeah, that's right. but that's something that is lost on us today. The Gemara names another animal whose waste affects its surroundings in this manner. And Rabbi Levi said, we must distance ourselves 4 amos from the excrement of swine. And so did Levi teach in a brisa, we must distance ourselves 4 amos from the excrement of swine, 4 amos from the excrement of the nemia. The nemia is going to be a small weasel-like creature, says the Rashi, and the Aruch says it's like a cat. The same law is going to apply to cats, by the way, and their excrement also reeks. And the Gemara is going to specify the nemia because at those times it was commonly found in people's houses. So if you have these animals in your houses, you're going to have issues with that. Now, it's also going to say, and 4 amos from the excrement of chickens. Chickens have a particularly bad smell when you have lots of them living there. You can even, if you have a neighbor that's actually, raising chickens, I feel bad for you because you'll be able to actually smell it from a very long distance. That's how bad it smells. The Gemara is going to qualify the ruling about chicken excrement, and Rabbi Yosef bar Avin, in the name of Rav Huna, says that it applies only in the case of red chickens. Now, the word red is adumim, that's in the plural, so it cannot be describing excrement, but rather the chickens. And the sages determined that the dung of red chickens smells worse than others. Another reason why would be if you're going to read adumim as Edomites, chickens in the land of Edom were fed with barley because barley there was poor quality and cheap, says the Bavli in Ketubot 64b, and also the Tosafot in Bavli 25a. Here, the consumption of barley by chickens produces a very bad smelling dung. That's the note here, and that's something that we don't remember because we don't really live near people raising chickens. But I once saw some crazy guy in California that was raising chickens, and nobody could sell a house around this crazy guy who was raising chickens, even though the land was technically expensive, because nobody wanted to live next to the horrible odor. It literally impacted the real estate market, and nobody could sell their house because once they realized it was a chicken farm and it would smell all the time and smell horrible, it basically killed the whole neighborhood. Really interesting, but it's real. Anyway, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that Rabbi Ami said Brisa teaches we must distance ourselves 4 amos from a foul odor, and this ruling is going to be qualified and says that Rabbi Ami says that the 4 amos is measured from the end of the foul odor. In other words, from the point where the odor dissipates and stops. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It says, when does this ruling apply? It's going to say that, when does it count to distance oneself 4 amos from when the odor dissipates? And it's going to say that, when the offensive item is going to be behind him, but if it's in front of him, he must distance himself from as far as the eye can see, and it must be beyond the range of vision. So Shulchan Aruch says like this in 79.1, it says that if the item's to the side and outside his peripheral vision, it is treated as though it's behind him. Nevertheless, if he can walk forward without great effort and leave it behind him, he should do so. And the Mishnah Berurah 79.5 says he is not required to turn away and face away from the excrement because it is to his east and he wants to pray in that direction toward Jerusalem. So that's some of the notes there, that you should really try to do what you can to move yourself outside of visual sight of it, because it's disgusting to you. It's disgusting. That's why you want to move it, not just move outside of the smell, but also from even, peripheral vision. The Gemara is going to elaborate on that last point. It's going to say that it reflects the halachic decision made in the following incident. It says that Rabbi Laya and some other colleagues were sitting in front of an inn at night, and they said to him, "What is the law in regard to studying words of Torah here?" In other words, what it's trying to point out is that there's going to be donkey excrement there around this inn, which would normally prohibit holy utterances, but now it's going to be. It says that it's at night, so that because it's at night, it's going to be dark, so they're not going to be able to see the donkey excrement. That's basically what's going on here. But all the Gemara writes is it says that it reflects the following incident, right? Rabbi Laya, some colleagues were sitting in front of an inn at night, and they said to him, "What is the law with studying Torah here?" Okay, so it doesn't actually write anything about donkey excrement here, but you have to infer it because that's what we were just talking about. Okay, that's really going to be what the question is. So this is not going to be holding your hand and walking you through it. You have to put in some work to understand that the donkey dung is nearby, and that, like saying the Shema when we were just talking about it, and covering yourself with this cloud of cloudy water in order to say it, they do have that cloud of darkness. They can't see it, but they know they're near it. So that's what it's talking about. And the Gemara continues, said that he said to them, "Since if it would be daytime, we would be able to see what is in front of us. Therefore, even now that the dark prevents us from seeing the excrement, it is prohibited for us to say sacred words here." So they must be outside of the line of smell, and they can't smell it, but nonetheless, it's in front of them. And there's a cloud of darkness there. They can't see it. And his point is that if it were to be daytime, it would be in front of them. And because it'd be in front of them, even though they can't smell it, they're not allowed to say it. And that's going to be the idea here. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to talk about a vessel that is designed to contain human waste. This was used for all of the human history up until they had a toilet. It's the chamber pot. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about what about a chamber pot, because this was the norm for the last, 5,900 years. Not 6,000 years, but we had toilets for about 100 years. So a Bryce is going to teach that if a chamber pot, whether for excrement or urine, is present, one must distance himself 4 amos from it, even if it is empty or odorless. One thing I want to point out about the toilet is that a lot of people will think that the greatest inventions in creating life expectancy was actually the discovery of penicillin and antibiotics and medication. But actually, the greatest thing for moving forward human life expectancy was actually the creation of toilets, because it got all this stuff out of the house, and from being, they used to just throw it out onto the street, and it could get into the water system, which was very common in England. They used to have cholera outbreaks because it would rain, they'd throw it out onto the street, and it would rain, and then the rainwater would flood and trickle into the communal wells, and then people would get cholera outbreaks. So one of the things that created a big jump in human life expectancy was that toilets would start to channel all of the waste so that it couldn't get into well systems, and it could get out of the house, and it couldn't spread disease. So the Gemara is going to say that a Brisa teaches that if a chamber pot, whether for excrement or urine, is present, one must distance himself 4 amos from it, even if it is empty and odorless. In other words, that it might have traces of waste on it. That's an idea, okay? So the brisa is going to deal with a vessel that currently holds urine, but was not designated for that purpose. It's going to say that if a vessel that contains urine is in front of the bed, the following laws apply. If one pours even the smallest amount of water into it, he may recite the Shema next to it. But if he does not add any water, he may not recite the Shema until he moves 4 amos away. There's going to be a dissenting view about that, but I want to point out something that the Rashba says in a parallel in the Bavli in 25b, where it talks about this. It says that under biblical law, the presence of urine prohibits prayer only when it is actually exiting the body. Once it has reached the ground or entered a vessel, the prohibition is merely rabbinic. And according to this Tana, the rabbis did not apply the decree when the urine has been diluted, even with a minute amount of water. And basically, says the Mishnah Berurah in 77.2, says that the brisa deals with urine that does not smell, and if the urine reeks and smells, it is no better than other, bad smelling items, which are prohibited at the biblical level. One would be forbidden to say sacred words near until enough water has been added to remove the odor. So, yeah, it's going to bring me up to a question I had that I saw when I was at the hospital the other day visiting my sick father-in-law. That a guy in a wheelchair came into the shul and he had a catheter bag there, and it was in the open. It wasn't open so you could smell it, but you could see it. And I was curious as to whether you're allowed to pray there at that time or not, or whether he had to cover it or something. Anyway, there's going to be a dissenting view, and Rabbi Zakkai said if one pours a rivus of water into it, he may recite the Shema next to it, but if not, he may not recite the Shema until he moves 4 amos away. The Gemara is going to interpret the brisa and ask, what is the minimum amount of urine that requires a rivus of water according to Rabbi Zakkai? And the Gemara is going to answer that. It's going to say a rivus of water must be poured into a rivus of urine. If the amount of urine is less than a rivus, a correspondingly smaller amount is needed. However, a single rivus of water suffices whether it is being added to a small vessel which contains one rivus of urine, or a large vessel which contains many rivayot of urine. So over here, it's saying that, says the Rashba in this commentary on the Bavli, 25b, saying that even if many rivayot of urine are in a vessel, a single rivus of water will neutralize it. That's something that I didn't know. In the opinion of the Vilna Goan, a small vessel contains urine produced at a time, while a large vessel contains urine produced by several different times. That's going to be the note by the Vilna Goan. In other words, what is a small vessel and what is a big vessel? And the big vessel will be that it contains urine from many times. That's the distinction. A Baraisa continues and says, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if the offensive item is behind the bed, one may recite the Shema because the bed serves as a partition. But if it is in front of the bed, one may not recite the Shema unless he moves 4 amos away. So, in the version of the Baraisa, in Bavli 25a, an unnamed Tana states that it makes no difference whether the container is behind the bed or in front of the bed. Either way, one may not recite the Shema. And this Tana is holding that even if the bed has a 10 tefach height required for a partition, it's not a valid partition, either because it is open or underneath. So the Beur Halacha says that Rabban Shimon Gamliel responds that the bed has a valid partition to the extent that the offensive item is no longer deemed to be in the same camp as the person. So that's an interesting idea about that. So there's going to be a dissenting view, of course, and Rabbi Shimon ben Shimon ben Elazar says, even if it is in a pavilion that measures 10 by 10 amos, one may not recite the Shema until he covers it or puts it under the bed, and moving 4 amos away does not suffice. The Gemara is going to decide that the halacha with respect to the preceding dispute. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha said in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Va that Rabbi Hanan of Tarta decided the law in accordance with the opinion of Shimon ben Elazar. So basically, the poskim are ruling, contrary to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that is permitted to recite sacred words in the same room as urine or an empty chamber pot, provided that one distances himself 4 amos from it. Question is, what happens if you can see it in front of you? What's going to be the law for that? In other words, that's going to be another issue. So, having discussed the nullification of urine, the Gemara is going to teach how excrement is nullified, and the Gemara says that Rabbi Binyamin bar Yafa says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if a minute amount of excrement is present, one can nullify it by covering it with spittle. In other words, that if there's something like phlegm, says the Ritva, it would obscure the excrement underneath. And that although a transparent covering will suffice for excrement, clear saliva is not valid for covering it because it is not transparent, but it's a liquid. It's not only transparent, it's also a liquid. So they're qualifying it. Then there's going to be talking about an incident in which the preceding permit applied. By the way, because it says the Ritva that it has to be like phlegm, which is going to be cloudy, that's going to be like the case like the Shema in the cloudy water. That's going to be the idea here. So this may not necessarily be a practical thing, but is trying to teach you a Talmudic point that has a consistency. In other words, it's trying to teach a consistent Talmudic point, not necessarily a practical one that you'll be doing now, but you should know the halacha for it because it is a thing that is consistent and it is a part of the oral law. And just like a train needs to have all of the cross ties on the railroad track to run, you need to have all of the halachot in order to run the train in your life. So this is part of the oral law, and maybe this is a law that you're not used to being around. Nonetheless, you need to know it. So the incident is going to come up about a permit. Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdi were sitting, and they were saying sacred words, and they noticed a minute amount of excrement. And Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdi rose and spat on it. And Rabbi Zera said to him, covering the excrement in this matter neutralizes only for the short time it takes to go from the Sea of Tigna, which is going to be the name of a place that's going to be near the sea. In other words, that it's not a permanent thing. That's basically what Rabbi Zera says. Rabbi Zera says that Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdi did nullify it for that short period of time, but there's a time limit on it because it'll dry out. Anyway, there's going to be various laws where a person may recite words of Torah and prayer, and the Gemara is now going to move on to where a person may store sacred writings. And again, we're talking about this sort of cloud covering. In other words, we're talking about things that cover, and now we're going to be talking about covers for Torah scrolls. All very fitting, and it all fits together like a nicely machined piece of machinery or something. Anyway, Gemara is going to continue and say, concerning a box that is filled with sacred scrolls, one may place it beneath the head of a bed, and one may not place it beneath the foot of the bed. So the Meiri is saying that it disgraces the scrolls to store them beneath the place one rests his feet. And that's going to be the idea about it. Gemara Fulda is going to say that the Gemara is not discussing a box placed beneath the bed, but placed next to the bed. And the Gemara is going to rule that a box of scrolls may not be placed next to the foot of the bed, but only at the head. So the Gemara is going to continue. It says, but one may not place it beneath the foot of the bed. The Gemara is going to qualify the permit that's going to allow a box of scrolls to be placed beneath the head of the bed. Rabbi Avin says in the name of Rav Huna, and this is stated only where the bed has 10 handbreadths high, and only where the ropes of the bed do not touch the box. In other words, that if these conditions are not met, that box of sacred scrolls may not be stored there, even beneath the head of the bed. That's basically the idea here. And the Gemara is going to support the ruling, and Rabbi Yosef rules in the place of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak in accordance with the ruling of Rav Huna. So what's going on here is that in Talmudic beds, says the Beur of Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, that in Talmudic times the beds were supported with interlaced ropes instead of springs. And even if the bed is 10 tefachim high, if the bed containing the scrolls is in contact with the ropes, it is regarded as being attached to the bed, and thus it is as if one who lies upon the bed is lying upon the box of scrolls and dishonors the scrolls. So that's going to be the deep insight about what's going on here from Rabbi Kanievsky. And the Gemara is going to cite a teaching on having relations in presence of a Torah scroll. And it says, a person may not engage in marital relations while a Torah scroll is with him in the house. In other words, Mishnah Berurah in 240, Safe 26, says that this is in the law is in the same room. There's going to be other Gemaras that are going to be saying in the same room as him as well. That's not just here. Anyway, the Gemara lists several scenarios in which one would be permitted to cohabit in the presence of a Torah scroll. Rabbi Yerushalmi says in the name of Rabbi Abahu, if the scroll is wrapped in a cloth, or if it is placed onto a window ledge that is the height of 10 tefachim from the ground, he is permitted to cohabit in the room. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says one prepares for it, the Torah scroll, a dividing curtain. That is, one places the scroll behind the partition, and then he is permitted to cohabit in the room. That's going to be the idea there. And then I want to bring up one more issue about this. It's going to say that a Gemara cites a brisa that teaches another restriction regarding a Torah scroll, that a person may not sit on a bench upon which a Torah scroll is placed. And an incident occurred with Rabbi Eliezer, this is going to be the Tana, that he was sitting on a bench upon which was placed a Torah scroll, and when he became aware of this, he recoiled from before it as if one who recoils from being in front of a serpent. So that Rabbi Eliezer had really great reverence for Hashem, and he was in great fear of dishonoring a Torah scroll, just like he's in fear for his life from being close to a serpent. That's the idea here. And another way to look at it, says the Rosh Cirilio, is that Rabbi Eliezer's pain at inadvertently dishonoring a Torah scroll was a degree comparable to the pain of a serpent's bite. So we have to have more respect for our Torah scrolls, and we have to do more to try to create honor for them and to cover them. And that's a deep key idea throughout this whole halacha, is about creating covers, having covers on things, covering things for kavod and for modesty and things like that. The Gemara is going to qualify the prohibition. It's going to say that if the Torah scroll was placed upon another object, that is itself lying upon the bench, it is permitted to sit upon the bench. That would be a case where somebody had. So let's look at the Mara Fulda about that. Mara Fulda says that the example is that one may place a board upon the bench and place the Torah scroll upon the board, because the Torah scroll is now at a different level than the person, and it would be permitted. So that's the idea about what's going on here, is that you've now put the Torah scroll at a different level from the person. That's the deeper insight here. And we want to understand, the cloud of glory that came before and was there around the tent and the camp, and that there, when Aaron died, the cloud of glory went away. And there's always this idea of concealment. The Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim that all of reality and trying to look at Kodesh Baruch Hu, that it's really opaque, that there's like a cloud, and part of this cloud is a cloud of material and a cloud of flesh that obscures things, so it's very hard to see the true reality, which is a clear God. That's the absolute clear reality. However, we are encased in flesh and material, and that material and flesh is what makes it obscure. That's going to be the idea there. In other words, that we're dealing with something like Einstein, like where Einstein says that there's not absolute time, that there's many times, and that just like that, the Rambam is saying that the absolute reality is something that's totally clear, but since you are put together with flesh, you are sitting there seeing things with a cloud that is opaque. So this is a big theme that's been through this halacha, and it's really a beautiful, beautiful halacha with a lot of ideas and rich with things to study. Have a great day.